despite being arguably the coolest fight in the DLC. Well, right after.
Curse you, Baal!
We don't really know very much about Midra or his doomed paramour, Nanaya. We're only told that Midra was a sage and he was the master of the Mans in the Abyssal Woods, which was an area that was forbidden to the Hornsent. And at some point, due to his contact with the Flame of Frenzy, Midra was executed by Hornsent inquisitors in a manner that ended up prolonging his suffering for who knows how very long. And the only thing keeping Midra from pulling out this barbed sword running through his body was the final behest of his dear Nanaya, telling him to endure. When I asked you to send me your best theories on who this enigmatic woman was, I was truly swept away by all of the really creative and original responses. So this video is actually going to be a surprise collaboration between you and I, and there's a very high possibility that if you contributed to that discourse, we will be discussing your musings here in front of everybody. So let's start with the most popular theory, that Nanaya was none other than Shabriri in disguise. A few of you drew a visual connection to Nanaya's portrait and the Shabriri's woe talisman, and it does indeed seem to be that they share that same flirtatious smirk. Nanaya's calm demeanor here, as well from what we can see at least, is in stark contrast to the extremely uneasy expression we see on Midra. It evokes a reaction that something isn't quite right with this couple. Nanaya's veiled gaze is also reminiscent of the concealed eyes of Shabriri and Hayeta. Shabriri also has the ability to body hop and reanimate corpses, so we do have a foundation for this idea that he might have possessed the body of Nanaya. And his reason for doing so would be to find or help create a candidate to become the Lord of the Frenzied Flame. And that is in fact what Midra transforms into once he pulls the greatsword out of his body. This greatsword of damnation was used to inflict upon Midra an eternity of agony, and right before he pulls it out, he says that he's endured enough. And he asks for Nanaya's forgiveness, which is his response to her entreaty that he endure. And we're told that this word was a curse. And the torch that Nanaya is cradling in her lap is actually a small spinal column that is the last remains of a man from a distant land who was born in an age long past, a man who failed to become the Lord of Frenzied Flame. So it does indeed appear to be that Nanaya had some kind of pre-existing and personal connection to the Frenzied Flame, enough to warrant her cradling the remains of this failed lord. In her plea to Midra to not pull out the greatsword, this would be for the sole purpose of pushing him to the point of so much agony and despair that all of this pain would season and ripen, making him strong enough to become a successful Lord of Frenzied Flame and carry out Shabriri's ultimate wishes. Being pushed to this point of hopelessness and injury, this can be a precursor for the Flame of Frenzy to inhabit you, and so this happens on a scale. So gameplay-wise, while it is a status buildup, it's also a story mechanic in this way because it implies that this is something that happens over time. The madness isn't instantaneous. So with Midra being forced to endure this agonizing existence for eternity, his madness buildup would have been monumental, and we can see that in effect. We can see the effect that his Giga Chad endurance had on the surrounding woods. And it's in all of the flora, it's in the fauna, it's in the water, it's in the rocks. Just compare the size of Midra's frenzied flame head to the dying flame on the torch. One of these was a failed lord, and the larger one was the success. And we're told that Midra was too weak to become a lord. So the tragedy that he had to endure for so long was necessary in pushing him to that point of no return. I can absolutely get behind this theory that Nanaya was just a corpse puppet of Shabriri's that he used to trick Midra into falling in love with her so that Midra would have a very genuine reason to endure, and in time he would grow despaired and anguished enough to eventually become a Lord of Frenzied Flame. And Nanaya suspiciously appears to be the only inhabitant of the Mans that didn't appear to have met a violent end. We see all of Midra's pupils lined up and bound and decapitated right outside the entrance, and the Hornsent servants inside have been burnt and tortured by inquisitors. One ghost even pleads for the cruelty to stop, But Nanaya is just splayed out in a chair, like she fell asleep and slumped over. So maybe Shabriri, deciding that he just couldn't wait an eternity for Mr. Midra to come along and become the Lord of the Frenzied Flame, he pieced out to the Greater Lands Between to find another candidate, a stronger, younger one, and he just left Nanaya's corpse sitting there to wither away. Another idea that was shared by several of you was that Nanaya may have been a conspirator against Midra, and maybe she was the one that kind of orchestrated this sting operation on the Mans to get Midra and shut him down. And so this idea would definitely make Nanaya the villain of this story. Another theory was that Nanaya was sent to the Mans by the Hornsent as a preventative measure to ensure that Midra wouldn't become the Lord of the Frenzied Flame, and that her plea for him to endure was the only thing keeping him from pulling his head off and burning it all down. And a very strong foundation for this is that Nanaya's robes are Hornsent robes. Specifically, they're the same robes of the little dead monks that you find all over the Hornsent capital. She has the same beaded tassels around her head that appear on the Grand Dam as well. The Mans itself has Hornsent architecture. We see the spiraled tree reliefs, the Solomonic columns, the same carved figures, the same lanterns. The servants are Hornsent. And the term Mans refers to a dwelling place. Specifically, it can be used in the context of a clergyman's residence, so where a minister would live. And knowing that Midra was a sage and the Abyssal Woods are referred to as his sanctum, which is a holy place or a private hideaway, this theme of religious language makes me come to the conclusion that this Mans was at some point intended to be a religious dwelling. And the attire of the beheaded individuals outside look like monastic robes in Buddhism, specifically the inner robe called the Uttarasanga, which leaves the right shoulder uncovered, which symbolizes the readiness to work. There's also a church in these woods, but strangely, it's called the Abandoned Church. It doesn't even have a name. And this podium inside, which usually features a statue of Marika, is just completely missing that figure altogether. It's like they never even got around to installing it. Construction on this church was halted. And maybe that's because Midra and his religious disciples got distracted with something else, and that something else being the Flame of Frenzy. Now, how would Midra, in this scenario, first have come into contact with the Frenzied Flame? The way that it's described throughout the game is somewhat similar to a contagion. It's called a sickness, and it first appeared in Shabriri after his eyes were gouged out as punishment. And by the way, I have a huge video coming out all about the themes of eyesight and the lack of it and why eyes are so important. So these themes of sight and blindness are extremely relevant to the story, but specifically in the case of the Frenzied Flame, it sounds like it's a disease that can infect emotionally vulnerable individuals. It can also be spread by eye contact, and we see that in action during the fight with Midra when he holds you down, not to bite you, but to stare into your eyes, which causes that madness buildup. There are also a lot of rats in the Abyssal Woods, and there's also a nest of rats in the attic of the Mans as well, and rats have historically been present during some of the most infamous plagues and illnesses in history. So the rats being here at the Mans and in the woods, this might just be another allusion to the Frenzied Flame being akin to a sickness or a plague. And there are also a few servants inside the Mans who utilize the Frenzied Flame as well. So clearly it had spread at this point. It was an infestation of some sort. But at the very root source of the Frenzied Flame is the Three Fingers. And in one of the rooms, tucked behind an illusory wall, we see a strange collection of stone fingers and stone eggs. And there was this quick and very poor attempt at hiding these, just throwing over some spare canvas. But clipping through these corners reveals the extent of what's actually underneath. These stone fingers are identical, although smaller, to the stone finger columns you see at the finger ruins. Now, are these living specimens? I'm not sure, possibly in their own way, sort of like some sort of flora, because they're described as growing at the finger ruins, and they do shed material, maybe similar to how a flower drops its petals, but this is now a direct connection between the Mans and the finger ruins. And the most incredulous connection of all is perhaps the fingerprints in the discussion chamber. At first, when I saw this room covered in hay, some of it burnt, I thought this was just like red embers glowing on the charred floor, maybe even blood. But upon closer inspection, these red marks are fingerprints, and lots of them. I actually zoomed out because I wanted to see if the shape on the ground maybe resembled a 3-fingered handprint. Alas, it does not. But it very much does seem like a large presence scorched this area. And these artifacts sticking up that look like serrated blades, I have no idea what they're supposed to be. So please hit me up with your best guesses on what these metal remnants might belong to. But this chamber is covered in hay, and with Midra's blanket in the middle, it's reminding me of a stable. And I'm wondering if these hints about the stone fingers and then the red fingerprints here, if these might be related to the 3 fingers. Did Midra accidentally, or intentionally without knowing the full consequences of, create the maddening 3 fingers? And upon this hay mound is where they were conceived, all of these scorched fingerprints. It's very obvious that there was something fishy going on at the man's, because nearly every single room has some kind of station for potions and concoctions, and there are burnt books everywhere. Midra and his disciples were clearly in possession of a lot of knowledge, probably forbidden, thus the horn scent swooping in and burning it all down. The word forbidden appears a couple times in relation to the Abyssal Woods and the Frenzied Flame, so I think that it was actually here at the man's and Midra where the horn scent learned about the Flame of Frenzy to begin with. The Frenzied Flame burns away everything, spirits included, for good. It is the irreversible end of existence, and that's why Torrent is so scared of the Abyssal Woods. The first time I experienced that, him bucking me off and then refusing to appear because he was scared, I got so freaked out. But then as you go into the woods, you find out why. It's because the Frenzied Flame has the power to kill Torrent and other spirits permanently, and that's why the horn scent forbid it. So I think that they may have discovered what Midra was meddling with here, and they came to destroy all of it, all of the research and the knowledge, and then they needed to kill everyone that was involved to make sure word of this wouldn't get out. And the disciples outside that are bound at the wrists and beheaded, they all have a glowing plug of some sort, like a cork that's meant to contain something. So this could be a symbolic execution, like a warning to those that dare meddle with the flame. And Midra, they executed with the Great Sword of Damnation, and that was meant to keep him alive forever, no doubt to teach him a lesson by inflicting on him the worst punishment of all time, since it was his man's. He was at the root responsible for the flame spreading here in their eyes. But I think the fact that the Inquisitors killed the disciples in this manner and then plugged up Midra with the sword, it might illustrate how they didn't actually really know the specifics of how the frenzy was being spread. They just corked up the body, hoping that would keep it contained, not really realizing that their weapon here, this great sword, would actually end up perpetuating Midra's madness until he was indeed strong enough to become a lord. And this is interesting, but when you kill Midra and the frenzied head disappears, his decapitated body looks awfully similar to the decapitated bodies outside the man's, which now makes me wonder, did they have like little baby frenzied flame heads on each one of them? Is that why there's a cork to plug it up? The ghost in the man's on the second floor that is pleading for its life, it asks this question. It says, what crime did great Midra commit? So I'd imagine that this ghost wouldn't be asking this question if it was already common knowledge that the horn scent forbid the use of the frenzied flame. So that's why he's asking what crime, because it wasn't made a crime until this event. I think it's just another clue that up until this point, the horn scent probably didn't have any kind of personal experience with the frenzied flame before. There were a lot of responses about the possibility of Nanaya being pregnant in this portrait, and even the discussion of whether or not she looks to have recently been with child as she appears here. And this leads into the next theory about Nanaya being a deathbed companion, and she was sent to give Midra a second chance at life. And the age discrepancy in this portrait really does lend itself to this theory, because my man here looks rough. He looks to be knocking at death's door. He's like one step away from being Fia's ex-boyfriend. So maybe Nanaya arrived at the man's to rebirth Midra as a lord, the result of which lays in her lap, but her not realizing at the time that he had been touched by the flame of frenzy, she then tells him to endure the Hornsent's punishment for the sake of sparing the world of the frenzied flame. And so Nanaya in this scenario is a heroic figure for trying to save everyone else that tragedy. Another theory based on this assumption that Nanaya is with child in this portrait is a very fun theory that questions whether or not Midra and Nanaya were Marika's parents. And this is based on a couple of interesting observations. Number one, the illusory wall that you first roll into in the main hall has a landscape that looks very similar to the one at Shaman Village. And because Shaman Village is so recognizably iconic due to that flowery golden landscape, are we meant to associate the Mans with it? Ymir also has a very interesting line where he tells us that Mikola knew his bloodline was tainted and that his roots were bogged down in madness. So is that supposed to be a callback to Midra? Even the naming convention of Midra and Marika sounds legit to me. So maybe Marika was born here at the Mans, which would make either Midra or Nanaya at least part shaman. And then when Frenzy hit the fan, Marika was sent off for her own safety. Maybe even the Hornsent DCF came in and took her away and raised her in the safety of Inner Ilm. There is a place in the Land of Shadow where you do get to see these same flowers that appear in this painting. And it's this area that's hidden behind a furnace golem at the ruins of Unt. And when you move that big boy out of the way, you see this cute little floral landscape. And I'm thinking that this is how the entirety of this area used to look at one time, way before the Crusades. So the painting in the Mans isn't necessarily supposed to link it to Shaman Village as much as it's supposed to illustrate to us that the abyssal woods weren't always abyssal. As for the topic of whether or not Nanaya is pregnant in this portrait, I simply do not know. It reminds me of a well-known painting called the Arnolfini portrait by Jan van Eyck, and while the female subject of that family portrait does appear pregnant, it's simply just an illusion created by her gathered dress that she's holding about her waist. So yeah, I don't know if we're meant to know for certain that Nanaya was pregnant and that the small spine in her lap is that of a baby's or of a small adult that's unrelated to her bloodline. Some of you pointed out that the torch might actually be the spinal column of Midra because it looks like he's got some purposeful incisions on his back that were stitched together at some point. But I don't know if I can't really imagine Nanaya performing spinal surgery, literally ripping his spine out. That is like straight out of Mortal Kombat. And Midra doesn't seem to have posture issues. After his transformation, he's standing very upright, so I don't think that this is his spine. I would be more inclined to think that it's Shabriri's spine. And Shabriri, being the sicko that he is, would use his meat puppet to carry his spine around. So where in all of these theories do those aging untouchables fit? Which are absolutely a callback to the winter lanterns from Bloodborne, by the way, which also cause madness buildup if they see you. And on top of that, there is a bug in the Abyssal Woods called the winter lanternfly. So is there a likelihood that these woods were their home first? And maybe that's how Midra was exposed to the frenzied flame? Because there is a torn diary page in the Mans describing how you can parry those guys before they touch you, so I do think this establishes a connection. But they also could just be the result of the infection of frenzy all throughout these woods. I don't know if there's enough information about them here, so I'm kind of leaning toward them just being a fun callback to Bloodborne and not necessarily being heavily involved with the story. So yeah, that wraps all of this up. I want to thank everyone who contributed on that post. It was so much fun reading through your ideas, and you all are just so smart and creative, so it really enriched my experience working on this. So if you enjoyed this, maybe we'll do another one of these community collabs looking at another character, and if you do want to do that, let me know which one. I want to thank my channel members so much for their support of my channel and my work. You all mean so much to me, and the encouragement and the support shared by everyone has just been so magnificent. And yeah, I just want to thank you all again for watching the video and your engagement, and I will see you next time. Bye!